And I quote, "I can't describe the feeling I had when I reached the top of a mountain. It was like nothing else. Suddenly, all the pain and heartache it had taken to get there was forgotten when I found myself stepping on top of the world. I'd put so much in getting up Denali, it was the coldest, most physically demanding thing I'd ever set out to do. The mountain was tough, but that day I was tougher. Even better, I conquered my fear." Welcome to A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation on Talk Radio 77 WABC. I'm Chuck Garcia, and my guest this evening, I am honored to present and to have him here on the show, is named Jordan Romero. And in case you don't know who Jordan Romero is, he's an American mountaineer who on May 22nd, 2010, became the youngest person ever to climb Mount Everest. He was 13 years and 10 months. He also climbed a lot of other mountains, including one in Antarctica called Vincent Massif. And in December of 2011, he became the youngest climber in the world to complete what is known as the 7 summits, the highest peak in each continent. He is now a student or graduated from college at Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah. Jordan Romero, welcome to A Climb to the Top.
Thank you, Chuck. It's an honor to be here on the show, and I can't wait to share some stories and lessons with you all.
Indeed, it is great to have you here. And for all my listening audience, they know I'm a mountaineer. You and I have had many mountains in common, 2 of them in the United States, Mount Mansfield and Mount Washington. I have been on the top of 2 summits, of Mount Kilimanjaro and of Mount Everest in Russia, but you have been on many more. I would love to begin, Jordan, first. What was it like to, in retrospect, to be a 10-year-old mountaineer?
I think looking back, I am amazed that my parents even said yes and actually took me seriously. I feel like 10 is really young, and it didn't seem like that at the time. Even when I was 13, I kind of was always looking around like, oh, what's the big deal? Like, I'm just 13. And then now I look back and I'm like, wow, that was pretty dang young. But yeah, 10, it was, I think it was just more so just following my curiosity. I think after I saw this mural, for the listeners that don't know, that I came across this mural that was newly painted over summer at my elementary school. And so when we were returning back to school, it was a piece of artwork that I just found myself like so fascinated with. And I just have always had a wandering mind. And for some reason, just seeing the names of the mountains all below Mount Everest, lo and behold, it's the most famous one that everyone knows. But to learn about these mountains that I didn't know about before, such as like Mount Aconcagua, Denali, and Kilimanjaro, and Elbrus, and Vincent Massif, and so on, I feel like I wanted to learn more about it. I wanted to see what these mountains actually look like, and doing some online research after school before my dad would come pick me up. So it took me a couple of weeks to even approach my parents and my family about this possible idea that I was sort of hinting at them at first, and then it eventually evolved into, why not try Kilimanjaro, just to kind of see where that goes, because that's where a lot of 7 summiters will often start, is either like Mount Kilimanjaro or Kosciuszko or something a lot less technical. And it was an experience, both fundraising for the mountain and just like getting everything in order. I feel like on the logistics side, my dad and Karen were both so avid in that through adventure racing, because they had already been world travelers. So we were kind of able to incorporate that minimalistic, carrying light gear style into Kilimanjaro, for example. The mountain took us 3 days, and so as we got closer to the top, though, I also remembered like, wow, I am 10 years old, and I do also have like emotions that can get the best of me. And so it's a mixture of homesickness. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't really fully know how to suffer too. And if anything, Kilimanjaro is a good one to start out with. There's less consequences, I feel like, for that to happen, other than altitude sickness. But that was a skill to learn, was to going back to that, learning how to suffer for me as a 10-year-old. And it took me like 2 or 3 years to kind of evolve that. And as we fast forward, like Denali was kind of that breaking pivot point in which I had a lot more confidence after that mountain to take on anything bigger and greater, such as Everest.
Well, let me go back in time. Most 9-year-olds who go to their dads or moms say, "Hey, can we go out and play catch?" And they hope for a yes or a no. Did you even contemplate that your dad would not only say yes, actually do what it is a 9-year-old asked to do?
I think that he in a way was very excited, I think, with the initial thought of like having something that him and I could kind of relate to a little bit more, because when I saw him and Karen doing adventure racing all around the globe, I would see them at their lowest of lows, like coming through some checkpoints, looking like they had, barely survived a war in a way, that it's just like brutal how it just breaks you down. And that just did not seem fun or appealing to me at all. So I feel like with climbing, he was just, excited to, be able to do something with me in that sense. And so he was just like super excited and on board to just like, adventure with his son, which, you could totally understand. And he was just more than happy to, say like, all right, we don't have the immediate resources, but we're going to figure it out and do a little like, you know, improvise along the way. And, that's what kind of led us to, we were a working class family. So we did have to fundraise for a lot of these climbs. And so I think the fact that he just believed in me so much and just had like the love, and Karen as well, who her and I aren't even biologically related, but she's been the equivalent of, a second mom in that sense. And she was just so on point with like logistically managing, the trips themselves. And she was to have us three, it was just a really synergistic and special trio, I guess, to really make it happen. So
Well,
yeah.
I'll say to our audience, Jordan, and I'll summarize, between the ages of 10 and 14, stepped on many of those 7 summits, including Denali, which is the one that I described at the opening, and then the last one, Vincent Massif in Antarctica. But there was something interesting, and I want to point out that I read this book, and for those who are watching us, hopefully you can see it. It's called No Summit Out of Sight. It's the book that Jordan had written and what he cataloged with Linda LeBlanc when he returned from the 7 summits. And what was really interesting, I looked at this not through the lens of a mountaineer, but I looked at this through the lens of a father. And Jordan was living in between 2 worlds. His mom, Leanne, lived apart in a different place. And Jordan, you lived, growing up, you lived in both places, right? You had shared custody?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, growing up, my parents were divorced, I think, when I was 3 years old. And so I never knew a life of, them being together at this point. Even to this day, I'm like just seeing their 2 personalities. I was like, you guys were together at some point. But, it's, so yeah, it was relatively different. My mom is, her background is education, and she kind of takes life a little bit more like she's a planner. She's a little bit more structured in a way. My dad is was very spontaneous and was just like, oh, let's go do this out of the blue, all the time. And so I think learning both characteristics, I think I was able to kind of, you know, attribute my personality from both of those in a way. I am a planner and I do like, obviously like thinking ahead, but I'm always, even last night too, like at 8:30 p.m., like my roommate was like, hey, want to go do this mountain tomorrow? I'm like, let's do it. I have nothing else going on. So yeah, we
Yeah,
just
but
made it happen and
interesting
woke
though,
up early. But
in reading No Summit Out of Sight, it's a love story in a sense, because there are 2 people, one that happens to be in the tent with him, and that's his dad Paul, and then there's Karen, who climbed with you, who loved you like a son, and your mom Leanne is back home while you're climbing these treacherous and potentially dangerous mountains. You related a couple times on the mountains where in the event you had a satellite phone, you called your mom. And I thought that was a loving tribute to, that's the first person you seem to have thought of to share the accomplishment. How did that feel, being between those 2 worlds and picking up and hearing her voice?
when you're asking how it feels, I think looking back, it was just such a, I don't know, it was definitely a lot of love for sure, in a sense in which I, obviously she was the first person, going back to what you said, that I felt like I had to share this with, and just like let her know that ultimately she wants to know that I'm safe, and that I'm at a certain point, because as we got closer to the top, our GPS basically, or our spot locator, was like slightly off track in a way. So everyone was kind of like, wait, it's been there for like a while. Why are they stopped or whatever? And then that's when my mom got the phone call, and it was just kind of more of like a reassurance. And so she was just, I could hear her crying over the other line. And she was just more so like, she was just always wanting to make sure that I was safe and happy, and I think that's not really much to ask for, but it can be, in a way. And so she's just like, and when you're at the summit of a mountain, you're not done. You still have to climb back down the exact way you came up. So, as long as I'm home, that's where you have really completed the trip.
Your dad was such a critical component. What was the dynamic like at 10, 11, 12, 13? You're accomplishing these amazing things, and you got this dad who's an adventurer, and he's really inspiring you. Yet sometimes there were, in the book you talked about, you were crying, and it's tough. And I can imagine, hey, as an adult, we were in tears sometimes over the pain. What was that like with your dad through each year that you were hitting a different major accomplishment? Did it change over time?
For sure. No, I'm glad you asked that. I felt like there was a lot more to learn about my dad. I think right when all the climbs first started, and getting to know him and his way of thought and the way that he approaches things. And it was interesting, kind of getting to know him and just seeing the mindset of someone who's willing to go run 500 miles in the middle of the desert with minimal resources, and like someone who really knows how to suffer. He it, Going back. I mean, he's a very smart and calculated person. He's worked in the medical field as an EMT, and doing life flight medics. So it was always reassuring to have him there with that knowledge, in a sense, in case something does go wrong. Like, he would know the first immediate procedures on what to do if anything were to go wrong. And so I felt like I was able to kind of absorb some of that within my own personality too, because it that was like the first thing, I think, when when a couple times things did go wrong, the first thing was to do was just like not panic at all, and to calmly assess the situation, and kind of just move consistently as far as like taking it step by step of how we can like resolve this issue, and how can we make an alternative plan, or do we need to turn around, or and I think like critical decision making too was like the big thing too, especially that was more from both my dad and Karen, because safety was always just our big mantra as we approached each mountain. We were always so good about like checking in with each other, and that's kind of how we got to know each other so well, was just like asking how we were feeling, if we were developing any high altitude sickness symptoms at all, or anything. So yeah, I think those were positive characteristics to take. And I think like between my mom and my dad, going back to that, I feel like I was able to, we all have drawbacks and whatnot, but I feel like, and nobody's perfect, but I try to just take as much of the positive sides of each personality, and try to run um, with those characteristics.
Yeah. Did you feel, looking back, your dad pushed you in a good way, a bad way, or was there always some combination in between that ultimately resolved itself when you accomplished the feat?
For sure. I think I think the way we approached training for each mountain was that was when I noticed my dad was definitely the hardest on me. And it's kind of like the same thing in the military. When you go through those hell weeks, or you go through those boot camps, they make sure that you endure the worst, during those points, so that after, and when you're actually out on the field, it's a lot more mentally manageable for those people. So that was kind of the same thing with training. I think he pushed me a lot harder for sure. Like even just training in Big Bear, and just whether it was mountain biking or like trail running or whatever it might be. If I was even running at a slower pace, I'm definitely going at the speed and pace above average. And he's telling me like, all right, dude, pick up the pace a little bit more.
Yeah,
And I couldn't even tell you, like, there were just countless times I was just like, pulling my hair out. I'm like, oh my God, this guy's really getting on my nerves. And Karen was good about that too. Yeah, I think both of them just knew, saw what I was realistically able to do if I just pushed a little bit further in a way. So I think mostly good. I mean, some might argue he might have been definitely a little hard on me, like during the whole training cycle as a young person. But honestly, I think it's ultimately resulted in positive results. But when it came to climbing, like when we were actually there, that was when it was just more focused on like working together as a team. And, we weren't like, there's just no, telling somebody to pick up the pace there a little bit. You're just trying to make sure that all of you get from point A to B safely. So
Yeah.
that's how we approached it. But yeah, same thing with training. It was just, that we made sure to like endure the worst for the most part as we were doing that.
You're listening to A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation on Talk Radio 77 WABC. I'm Chuck Garcia, and my guest this evening is very proudly to present Jordan Romero. Jordan, you described part of your training as an 11-year-old. I think your dad gave you a tire from an SUV, and you wrapped that tire around you, and you attached a rope to it, and you dragged it up the hills. And Big Bear Lake is 7,000 feet above sea level where you grew up. What was it like at that age when your friends were out playing baseball and soccer and all the things and riding their bikes, and you're running up hills with attached to the tire of a Ford Explorer? How are you feeling when everyone else was having fun and you weren't?
That was tough. That was tough in looking back, as far as, just coming straight home from school. And this was during middle school. My school was literally right down the street from our house, basically, which we called like the base camp. And so I walked probably about like a half mile home, and straight away, just like, I kind of learned through that point, I was like, I can't sit down, because if I sit down, I'm going to dread the training process more. So it was more of just like learning how to just get home, eat something, and then go straight into it, just so I don't have to like remotivate myself, you know. And so that whole process was it was tough for sure, because I felt like that is kind of what started, I think, the feeling of like missing out, I think, with of like hanging out with friends. And looking back, like, I obviously shouldn't have cared, but for me as an 11-year-old, I just did. Any kid that age would. And so to come home and to put on this 45-pound backpack at least, and just get on the harness, uh, you know, clip the carabiner that was like attached to the rope to the tire, like straight onto my harness. And then, so we lived on like a steeper, non-maintained dirt road. Literally during the winter, we would have to shovel this road because plows didn't even come through here. So as you kind of entered up my street, it was like kind of flat, like up, all dirt, and then it just slowly got steeper and steeper. And our house was kind of right where it got steeper, and it was just laps up and down, which I could probably say was about like 350 yards or something, like back and forth of just running up and down. And I think it was at least like 10 laps or something that I would do, at least on a daily basis, at least like 3 or 4 times a week for the most part. But yeah, that's just like what the primary method of training was, to kind of strengthen my hips and my core a little bit, so that I would be able to tow sleds with numerous amounts of gear on Denali. And after all, it definitely benefited me greatly. And obviously, as you're towing a sled on snow, it's not as much traction on the sled. So, but even on the steeper parts, like, it helps so much. So
yeah,
overall,
it's a
I'm glad I
definitely
did it.
Navy SEAL training. If you ever read about
Totally.
what they go through. Let me switch the focus, Jordan, because now when you return from what were these amazing accomplishments, you were on 2020 and the Today Show. Now you're coming home at the age of 15. And by the time college came around, you're settling into what is a more traditional life. You decided to go to Salt Lake City. How come?
So I chose Salt Lake City because I got to know this place really well going to outdoor retailer trade show, which happened twice a year, one in the summer, one in the winter. That was where it was that gathering and convention alone that was the source of all of our connections that we made to be able to, afford these trips a little bit more with free gear and sponsorships and all that stuff. And so Salt Lake, and that convention was kind of like what allowed that. And so I got to know Salt Lake quite a bit. And as I got into skiing more and more, like Utah just looked like the absolute mecca and like where I just should be, because Big Bear is great. And like, looking at friends that grew up in the Midwest and the East Coast, like Big Bear was pretty awesome for sure, like to learn how to ski. And but we just don't get snow there. And so like middle of January, it's 60 degrees and you're wearing sunglasses and you're just shedding layers. So and then, you go from 20 inches of natural snow a year because they have to, make snow in Big Bear, coming to a place that averages like 400 was just like an insane difference. So it just felt like the right move for me. It also is, I was kind of like debating between like Colorado and Lake Tahoe as well. And
Yeah.
I think as far as just opportunity and living in a city with incredible access to literally whatever you want to do. It doesn't matter what outdoor sport you do, as long as you're not surfing, so we're just not by the ocean. But
Yeah, you're
everything
landlocked.
else, everything else is here. If you are a rock climber, you are probably in one of the best places in the world for that. Mountain biking, oh my God, world class here. Like, mountain running, skiing, all this stuff. Like, it's just unbelievable. There's amazing rivers. If rafting is your thing, down the state a little bit more. Like it it's I can't find anything this place doesn't have other than the ocean, being more landlocked. But
But you did
it just
something
seemed like the
different.
perfect fit.
Understood. And yet in high school, when everyone else says, I'm going to go to UCLA and wherever there's going to be, you made the conscious decision to go to Westminster College, which is a lovely place nestled in Salt Lake City. But Jordan, this is interesting. Your transformation is almost flip-flopped to 99.9% of the people, because you've lived these amazing accomplishments as a teenager, and now you're settling into a routine life. What did you study, and what is the next chapter potentially looking like for you?
Thank you, Chuck. Well, as far as traveling around the world goes, I felt so amazed and grateful to have the perspective of seeing what other cultures live like around the world. And that was when I understood that as I travel around the world, I realized that my world isn't the world. And I feel like that's what, sorry, excuse my throat. My I come from a small town, and the perspective is super limited, amongst who I went to school with, and for numerous reasons. Like, obviously, there were a lot of kids who grew up in like borderline poverty and lower income that I grew up with, and so like I understand why they don't really have that. And there's people who don't leave Big Bear really ever, and it's a small town. You're kind of like in an island comparatively. In Southern California. And so it's just the small town mindset. And I think after seeing that, I realized like, Big Bear isn't the world. The US isn't the world. It's like it just made me a lot more aware of things that go on, and realizing that like, whatever I discard with trash will end up somewhere else on the opposite side of the world at some point. And I kind of understood that everything comes around a little bit full circle. So I think it was just focusing into like my environmental studies degree, which is what I ended up pursuing in college. I just kind of like got into the specifics of that and kind of how to approach these problems as a leader, and also thinking a little bit more long term, and kind of thinking about, obviously you have to consider like economic implications if you're going to put in environmental policy, and how that affects the economy. So I got a minor in economics just so I have that kind of solidification of kind of a reality check, in which I feel like that's kind of lacking with a lot of people who are kind of environmentalists and, further left, because I feel like they don't really, I think you got to come into it with like a business perspective too.
Right.
So I thought that was really important. So I think as long as we can find those solutions that everyone's on board with, that does benefit, the economy and businesses, and just global trade, I feel like that's kind of the only way to do it, and to get out of this mess that we've inherited / are kind of perpetuating. And so it just kind of made me realize too, I mean, it's our Earth too, but it's ultimately our human species that we're looking to continue, and that is what's at risk in a sense. Like the Earth has endured so much, but it's just a matter of saving ourselves. And so, but I think like we have to get creative, and I think I love discussions and just talking about that, and having people play devil's advocate, or having me do that, and just trying to like really challenge those perspectives.
When you were 14, before you actually went to Antarctica, you did a TED talk. And what you talked to, it looked like you were in Redmond, Washington. You talked to a group of students. And you had mentioned at that time that when all is said and done, you're going to dedicate yourself to help people find their Everest. Here you are now, several years later. Is whatever you decide to do, is that still your mission?
Absolutely. I think it's evolved, of course, as it should, but I think it's kind of on the same track. I it was a little bit more goal oriented as far as the whole find your Everest message that I would communicate to youth and people who are my age and even younger, all around the U.S. and the world. And so I think that it's evolved more in a sense of like, you ultimately have to find out who you are. And I think I try to relate to that as far as like, I'm 23 and I still have a whole life ahead to figure out. But I think the biggest challenge, obviously after that was just like kind of finding out who I am. And I think authenticity is just such a, I think that's what makes us human and what makes each person so special, and that's why I think like just understanding what you want, not because other people like to do it and all that stuff. I want to ask these kids, like, what do you want? Like, what do you foresee yourself doing? Like, what do you feel like your purpose for existence is? And I think it's just having them at least like take a step back instead of being like, oh, like get up off the couch, write down a goal and all this stuff. It's like, let's take that step, let's create the foundation for that a little bit more. Like, who are you? Like, what do you like to do? What are your interests? And just kind of go down that same, series of questions and ask that person, like, who is the person you want to become.
Let's leave them with the advice that we close every segment with. What do you want all of those listeners out there, whether in the mountaineering metaphor or not, what do you want them to think, to feel, and to do with their futures?
Think proactively, think outside of the box. That is what I feel like kind of like limit a lot of people, is just kind of thinking like, even when it comes to like career searching, I hear about these, positions, and I'm like, wow, like I never even thought about that. So just thinking outside the box, feel of least resistance, quoted by Richard Carlson, one of my favorite authors. The path, feeling out that path of least resistance, and to and what I want them to do is start today. Because what I've realized too, I'm a master procrastinator. I know that
I wouldn't have thought that.
no, I am. Trust me. Like, continuous
Oh,
late nights in college and whatnot.
I
But
think I'll climb Everest when I'm 12. Yeah. Procrastinator. Yeah, right.
but what I want you to do is like, yeah, literally at least start thinking today. Because the more you put it off, the more that day is least likely to come. And that's what I'm finally realizing now, is just start today. If not now, then when, is the question you got to ask yourself.
Well, what I'd like to do, we're going to close here on the segment for 77 WABC, and I want to continue on with you, if you don't mind, if you've got a couple minutes for our listeners. You can always find me at chuckgarcia.com. My email address is chuck@kleinleadership.com, but many of you are watching our episode archived either on my website or on the YouTube channel. I am going to put the entire episode of this on the YouTube channel. So if you are listening live on ABC, you can switch to my YouTube channel right now and the full episode is there. You have listened to A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation on Talk Radio 77 WABC. I am Chuck Garcia, and I was very pleased and so honored to have our guest, Jordan Romero, join us from Salt Lake City. Jordan, thank you for coming on to the show and for sharing your story.
Thank you so much, Chuck, and for having me on, and also for reading my book too. It
No,
really means a lot.
it was a great
Every
book.
purchase, every person who's just willing to set aside time out of their day to do that, I'm really grateful. Thank
And
you.
again, to our listeners, the book is called No Summit Out of Sight. It is a wonderful account. To me, it is a love story, as I mentioned. There is so many cool lessons in there, not just for mountaineering, but the way we live our lives. Good night to our audience. Hang on. We're going to keep recording. All right, now we're going to switch to YouTube. Now we can explore a little bit more. In your TED Talk, you talked about three inspirations. One of them is the art of inspiration. One of them is your friend Nigel Holland, who will discuss what you carried up Everest in just a second. You also talked about the inspiration of a wonderful individual named Ank Pasang Sherpa. First thing is I want to explore the art of inspiration. What did you mean? And did that meaning change over time?
Not necessarily. I think the art of inspiration just kind of reminds us about, that whole thinking outside the box mentality, and how creative, how out of the box creations can oftentimes, like, you never know who's going to stumble upon that one day, and carry on with that seed of inspiration, and essentially, like, turn it into something else amazing. And so that's what I feel like is just so important. Like, I feel like artwork, in a sense, is just like, it's what makes us human. It tells us stories, and it inspires us. And so that is kind of what I've understood it more as, as I've grown up. And back then it was just like, it was a mural to me. But I feel like in the bigger picture, I feel like that's why, art is just so amazing. And for someone to, there's the list of the seven summits, but someone was able to approach that blank white wall, and, in a sense, think of an amazing way to kind of capture whoever is walking by it. And ultimately, that was me. And I always quote, his name is or thank, at least, Mr. Danner, who was a fifth grade teacher, and it was him
Who's
and his
listening now?
students who over summer had completely redesigned the school with all sorts of cool artwork, and it just so happened to be that particular wall that I just walked by one day, and kind of ran with the idea. And so it was just ultimately from that small decision of his to, or the approval from, like, from the school board to say yes to this, it was just that, second, I guess, that completely transformed my life in a way. So it's just like, you just never know.
Yeah, to our listeners and viewers, very early on in the book, Jordan talked about that mural and he looked at it and he stared at it and he recognized the one mountain bigger than the next, bigger than the next. That piece of art brought your climbing life to life. It's a picture. It not only said 1,000 words, what it did to you was the very basis of the origin of who you became. That's really awesome. One other thing I do want to explore, and I loved reading it about the book. You were handed something from a friend of yours named Nigel, who at 8 years old was diagnosed with cancer. And he handed you a bag and he started to chuckle, and you were chuckling like, what's so funny? Can you describe what he handed to you and what you carried up Mount Everest? And I would love to know what became of Nigel.
So at one of our fundraisers, at a restaurant that was willingly able to partner with us, and kind of help us at least get as much, like, cash as we could get together. The whole community showed up for their support, and Nigel was a younger brother of a friend of mine who, at a young age, at 6 or 7 years old, was diagnosed with brain cancer. And he it was an overnight transformation, literally, from the kid who he was to, who he became post diagnosis, which was saddening, if anything. And but at the same time, though, I could tell, like, his brain was still, like, he still had a sense of humor. He still had all the things to kind of make you laugh. And the thing that he was giggling about was he had handed me, because his dad is Australian,
I
and
figured
he
with the name
handed me,
Nigel, he was either English or Australian.
yeah. Well, and also why he had a keychain of kangaroo testicles, which is always kind of a, a funny thing to kind of interject in the story. Uh, but here's this kid who, you know, hasn't really, who doesn't get out of like Southern California much, and I think it was just like a special thing to be able to bring this item of his, all the way across the world to a place that not that many people get to go to, and to kind of bring it back. And yeah, it always like reminded me to, take that extra step further in exchange. But it really meant the world to him,
Well, he was in a
bringing those back.
wheelchair at the time. Is he still with us?
Correct. Unfortunately, he is not. Actually, as of semi recently, as of roughly 3 years ago, he had passed on. But his spirit still lives, and overall, I thank him a lot for what he did. And ultimately, it was he played a big role in reminding me not to turn around when I could have gone an extra step further.
It was a lovely part of the book because you were dedicating every one of those steps. Your mindset was with Nigel, a young lad who couldn't get out of his wheelchair, who was rooting you on and was probably around when you hit those summits, that he was able to hoot and holler. So Nigel, your family out there, my heart is with you wherever you are. We hear you. We love you. Thank you for being a part of Nigel, of Jordan's journey, because as a reader of that book, I felt that. And I'm grateful for that because I understood what you did in the service of Jordan's success. And Jordan very much thought about what he could do to honor your spirit. There's one last person here, and I climbed Kilimanjaro with this cultural group called the Chagas. They were the guys that trekked us up and made food, and they did wonderful things. But you also described the Sherpas, as I know many of my friends who climbed in the Himalayas, that it can't be done without those guys. They are the most, and you also talked about the personalities, loving, joking around, and they're about 5 feet 4 inches, and they put 100 pounds on their back. Can you talk about Ank Pasang Sherpa is a very important guy in the history of Everest. Can you talk about him and why in that TED talk he was the third part of that triangle?
Of course, I think Ank Pasang was, I think he spoke for a lot of people who I met along the way who come from limited opportunity, especially in a place like Nepal, and to kind of understand the economic impact of Everest itself, and how that has kind of created this new opportunity for people like Ank Pasang and the rest of the Sherpa community, has had a really profound impacts over time, especially since the 1950s when Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first made the summit. So I think it was just overall just the conversations with him, just getting to know what his family is like. And I'm always a naturally curious person, so I asked him all sorts of questions just along the whole expedition, just getting to know him better. And
he
it's
has
kind of one of
20 times or some.
Yeah, he summited Everest, I think, at that time like 3 or 4 times. It wasn't like
I didn't
the
know.
world.
I know it was a big
No,
number.
no, the world record is like 20 plus, I think, for the most sense. But yeah, but it was the combined experience of him and our two other Sherpas, Lama Dala and Lama Karma Sherpa, who are amazing. Lama means priest in their language. So I think looking back, I feel I've watched a handful of documentaries and stories, just kind of realizing that the culture of Everest has changed even since I've been there, which was 10 years ago. It's changed a bit even since then. In 2015, that was another tragedy of a year, and what happened. And for the listeners that don't know, it was basically a freak accident that happened in the Khumbu Icefall, and during that season, there were well over a dozen Sherpas that were completely, um, you know, not even to be found after. And in their culture, they need proper burial for reincarnation, basically. So it was just absolutely devastating for the families. And so not only all the guides on Everest were kind of, freaking out and being a part of that, but it was also like um, the the tourism board of Nepal got into it and all this stuff. It was just like a big clash. Basically, I feel like it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and you kind of understand how Sherpas, in a sense, have been feeling. I think for all this time, they really do put their lives on the line for for these clients and these climbers. I like to say that we kind of approached it as much, we wanted to make sure that we all equally contributed. I feel like amongst our team, because it was only a team of 6 that ended up going up to the summit. So it was all about just looking out for each other, and not necessarily like, the Sherpas kind of holding our hands in a sense, or at least we like not to think that, but it's just kind of realizing, like, these guys are human beings too. They have families to care for. They have children to feed, basically, and this is how, like, what we pay for this expedition is their income, essentially. And so we ended up going with a lot smaller of a business called Sherpa Adventures in Kathmandu. And so it's a Sherpa owned business entirely. They were, in hindsight, I'm so glad we chose them over like a traditional, like, Western guide that most people would particularly take. So I don't know. I feel like there were lessons to take from that, and kind of humbled me for sure at 13, and just made me realize that, we're all different, but we all have the same needs of just, wanting, some sense and form of, like, dignity, or, food on the table. And a lot. And I quote Anthony Bourdain on this. I think one of the best things that I've also kind of realized that he says from all of his travels is that most people that you meet are doing the best they can.
Doing the best they can.
And
I want to finish here, and this is more of introspection to the mind of a 23-year-old. What have you learned about yourself since the time that you walked up Arusha, or you're in Kilimanjaro, and you thought, all right, here's one, who knows where this is going to take us? And now you're graduating from lovely Westminster College. You've got a chapter out there. You could write it any way you want. So let me go back to that. What have you learned about yourself in all this time?
Thank you. I over the past 10 years, I've always found a need to continue traveling, but I think with kind of a different purpose. I think mountaineering in of itself, and just like any other sport, is relatively, like, ego driven in a sense. And I think to also ask yourself, like, what are you bringing to the table, as far as, like, how it can benefit the area that you're visiting, that, and it is in some way, it's the income of the guides and the porters, especially in a place like Kilimanjaro. But, like, what are you, like, what is your footprint going to look like when you leave, essentially? And so that's just something I've kind of thought about, looking back and over the past decade or so, after completing all these climbs. And there's places that I saw that were in need of help more than others, for sure, looking back. And like Indonesia is definitely one of them, and Nepal for sure, with just some of the most kind and welcoming people in the world. And that's where I kind of feel like my instinct to kind of help people and kind of take a humanitarian approach, and to just kind of, get involved in creative discussion, and just kind of thinking outside the box of, like, what's gonna, in the long run, benefit those areas the most. And one of the things I've learned ultimately is after doing a couple trips to do the unskilled labor of building schools in rural areas in the country of Malawi, which I did when I was 16, 17.
Cool.
I learned education is a huge form of it. And we like to take it for granted here in the States, obviously. And I think it's not perfect, and there's ways how we can definitely tweak it to kind of like, let students kind of follow their curiosity a little bit more. But we also kind of take for granted like the impact of just an elementary school in a community, where where there's like a high illiteracy rating, um, and just the overall poverty side, very difficult to, the impact of education and self-empowerment. That's just something that I saw just had the most long term. It just makes the most sense to kind of implement that as long term change. So at this point right now, I'm just kind of trying to blend all these ideas together and trying to just like put them all into a little box, basically. And so it's a lot of brainstorming, honestly. And yeah, for sure, I think I've learned a lot about myself for sure. College and post Seven Summits kind of left me a lot with the question of what now,
Right.
which was pretty tough. And I'm in high school too, and it's you got a lot of other stuff going on. You're growing as well, and so
Mhm.
overall, it can definitely get the best of you mentally. I think physically, I've kind of ran with like being a strong person, but I think like just being able to mentally comprehend like challenges and knowing how to grind and like even suffer a little bit for an ultimately better outcome is kind of something I've uh, that I've learned about. And that's the big thing too. I think teaching kids that all around the country, and when I go do talks like around schools that have read my book, I you know they always ask me, were there times when it wasn't fun? I'm like, of course, of
Yeah, you want
course.
a very
There
long
were
list.
so many times when it was not fun. There were times when
I
I
tell
just
people
wanted
that
to
all the
pack
time.
everything. There were times when I just wanted to pack everything up and just go home.
God, I want to
Uh,
order a beer, and what do
so
I got to
yeah,
do to
no,
get a beer on this mountain?
seriously, yeah, no, for sure. And it's just like, yeah, it's just like kid, and that's the other thing too. I think with like social media right now, as well as you're only limited to seeing the highlights of other people's lives. People don't go out of their way to share, the things that their character flaws or unfortunate things that happen to them. Like people just don't share that, and so that's a difficult thing that I feel like I want to like at least kind of raise awareness about. Is I think like mental health is kind of something that is being more talked about, along with the many other problems that we're facing right now. But even right now, if I'm just like sitting on my phone and looking at the news and social media all day, like that's going to have a pretty bad mental impact on you for sure. So even just like getting out to go run, or just kind of realizing that like these people, on Instagram, life's perfect, and you make it and you show your life the way you want it to. And
Yeah, what people don't
that's what
see,
that's what a lot of people don't see. Yeah,
they don't see the space between. They see the entry on
totally,
Instagram, and they see the other entry on Instagram. Your book, you revealed the space between, as many of us do to our closest friends. But for those of us that are authors, we have to decide, what are we going to write? And
for sure.
oftentimes, the really good stuff that we can write about changes over the course of our time. You're
It
now
does.
23. When you and Linda wrote the book, you were talking through the lens of a 14, 15-year old, but you had lived the life of most 30 and 40-year olds. So you've completely flip flopped. And now at 23, you're in this other place now where you can think differently, but you change. The world changes. This is the theory of relativity. And yet you come at the remainder of your life. And what I love about help people to find their own Everest, man, that is lovely. And I'm blessed, for what you have done, inspiring in the service of others. And yet you got 50, 60 years ahead of you, and you don't need to climb a mountain to do it. You're now climbing proverbial mountains in the service of other people's success. That doesn't get any better than that.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. And that's what I always have to remind myself about too. I'm always prone to like being down on myself for whatever reason. But it's when you put it that way, it's really awesome, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
I just feel among those of us, I'm not a mountaineer to your achievement. I was a Wall Streeter that raising 4 children, and I wanted to follow my dream. In fact, when you watch the pilot episode of what Dominic produced, you'll get it. You'll understand
For sure.
my
Well,
transformation occurred. I stepped on Mount Rainier, and that's when, oh my God, it unleashed the beast in me. And a year later, Kilimanjaro. A year later, I was in the Matterhorn, and then just going. But I did not know, nor could we have predicted, the impact that mountaineering had in our lives, not just to us, but what we can bring to other people in the metaphor of what we have been through physically. We recognize not everybody needs to climb a damn mountain to feel good about it. They got other things they're going to do, whatever that is. But you said in the book, it was, in fact, let me get up the right quote here. I don't want to screw this up. Just a second, and I can edit this. But here is one of the expressions that came, and it came out, and it said, "Dream big, live life, do something." That's a simple command.
yeah,
It's simple, but it's not easy. A lot of people don't do something.
absolutely. I've always approached everything in life as minimalistic as possible, and I'm always a big advocate for simplicity. But even a lot of the simplest things can be very challenging and complex to even achieve, for sure. And that quote says it right there. It's like, it's abstract, but at the same time too, it's like, and it's what, 6 words.
Yeah, that's a call to
It's
action.
but it's also like, it makes people think like, wow, okay, it's a whole lot to kind of unbuckle, I guess. I think from there, and but in that sense, it kind of goes back to the art of inspiration. It's just one simple thing that could produce some amazing results amongst people, and challenge them to creatively innovate.
And we'll leave it there. Jordan, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for your time, both on the prep call and for this. To our
Thank
listeners
you.
out there who are watching us, thank you for tuning in to our YouTube channel and to A Climb to the Top on 77 WABC. And Jordan, I hope we will, well, not I hope, that's up to us. We stay in
I'm
touch.
sure we will.
Let's continue as we climb these mountains in the service of other people's success. We are taking different approaches to do it, but there's concentric circles here. There's intersections about how we can help others. So let's just keep that current running. I will post you on all developments. I'm grateful for taking the time to review the body of work called The Climb to the Top, which is a pilot episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But to our
Yeah.
listeners, I wish you all a good night. Keep climbing, as Paul says. The mountains want you. They want you to climb them. So,
Absolutely.
that was your buddy in Kilimanjaro. I forget his name. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I forget, but yeah, no, it's
The
true,
mountains
man.
want you to climb. So get out
Yeah,
there.
they're not gonna climb themselves. That's for damn sure. But yeah, it's they make us learn a lot about each other and whoever you're with, and just as you go through the ups and downs, you really just get to learn who you are and whoever you're and about whoever you're with. So
Well,
it comes full circle, and
I'll conclude here. In Jordan's TED Talk, it was to a bunch of students, and he asked them to write down their goal on an index card. And he put the goal on their heart, and he asked them to close their eyes. And they closed their eyes. And he said, "All right, now take one step. And they did. You have just taken one step closer to the top of your mountain." That was an absolutely smashing way to end a talk. And I think it's a metaphor for you, Jordan, guiding others. And for that, we are blessed.
Thank you. Yeah, that the way of closing out a talk, which is exactly that. That's what Terry helped me with, and it was an amazing idea. And yeah, we had a talk a little bit prior to this, and we were just thinking like, wow, we met 10 years ago. Like, where did the time go? And it was awesome. We had a good talk.
Okay, Jordan, communication lines wide open. Very grateful for this. Thank you, and good
Likewise, night. Yeah, for sure. I'll give a peep for your pilot, and I'll let you know what I think about it. It's the least I can do. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. See.